So now that Steve has implemented our secondary spotlights in the scene, let's go ahead and turn our attention over to our character's lighting rig. Now, if we were to jump over here to the whiteboard real quick, if you recall when we presented the introduction to the lighting section on the whiteboard, we had talked about the character rig consisting of 3 lights. Technically, you could say 4, but this 4th light is not actually a part of the rig that will be traveling along with our character. We're going to have a distant light up underneath the floor, providing an upper or bottom side, if you will, illumination. Basically, it's going to simulate bounce light that's going to be coming back up off of our wooden floor. Now, for the 3 lights that are going to be moving along with our character, let's spend just a second and review those. We're going to have a rim light, and finally a fill light on the front. So this should give us a nice bright highlight on one side, a nice bright illumination on the other, as well as an equal illumination on from the front. Now, the key to this rig was that these lights needed to be able to rotate around the character in such a way that no matter what camera we're looking through, the lighting is consistent, meaning we always have this even amount of light on the front, and we always have these 2 side rims worth of light, or the illumination on the side of the character's head. So to pull this off, we're going to create a null, and we're going to have this null always look at the camera that's responsible for that particular shot. Then we're going to take rim light A, B, and our character fill light, and we'll have these 3 lights as children of this null. So as the null is rotating, because it's needing to always look at a particular camera, you'll find these guys rotating around our character, keeping that relationship in place. Now, later on in time, we're going to be creating a render script that will handle all of our render passes for us. When we start dealing with different shots, we will be dealing with different cameras. As we are dealing with different cameras, we really don't want to have to tell our script that it needs to go in there and for different shots reassign the camera that the null is going to be looking at. So the easiest way to combat this and keep things simple is to duplicate off the hierarchy that we have for our character lighting rig. So here we are with a null, our 2 rim lights, and our character fill light. If we were to select all of these and duplicate them off 2 more times, then we could simply say in Steve's render script that shot 02 is going to use this guy right here. So basically he'll be using these lights for illuminating the character. Shot 03 will use the duplicated lights for rendering the character, because again, those duplicated lights will be, by the way, pointing to fictitious lights that don't actually exist on the whiteboard. Just want to make sure everybody realizes that. But these lights over here will be parented to a null that will be respecting shot 3's camera. And finally, same thing for shot 4. We will tell it that these lights way over here will be illuminating our character, and they are children of the null that will be respecting shot 4's camera. So that's what we want to get set up in this video. Steve, let me go ahead and turn it over to you to get the ball rolling.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start out by creating our bounce light, our distant light underneath the character, and then we'll go ahead and create the rest of the character rig afterwards. So I'm going to jump into Houdini. I'm going to create a distant light. I'm going to push enter to create that at the origin. Now, a distant light, it doesn't actually matter where it's positioned, because it's only the orientation of this light that is going to affect how the light is cast. However, to make things as clear as possible for everyone watching this video, I'm going to move this light over to where our character begins so we can see how the light should be interacting with our character. So let's move him over to where our character is. I'm going to rotate him up in X by 90 degrees, giving us a purely vertical light, and then I'm going to take this and rotate it just off slightly in Z. So not a huge amount, but just enough that we're going to get slightly directional light. Even that's probably too strong. Probably something like, well, that's not quite enough. Yeah, it's very slight, so even if we're behind the character, we'll still get some upper illumination, but it's just so it's not purely straight on and direct. So that's going to be the orientation of the light setup. So let's jump over and set up the light parameters. So I'm going to create this light as a deep red light. So something around this kind of deep red maroon color. This is going to be way too bright when we render out for what we're going to need for the final composited render, but we're going to be rendering this light out in its own path, so we'll have complete control over its intensity when we come to do the compositing. I also want to make sure that we are only contributing diffuse with this light, because since this is a bounce light, it's a very minor light in the scene, it doesn't make sense to have specular highlights come from this light. So we can do a quick test render. This is going to be overly red, but it will give an idea of where we're going with this red bounce light. Let's just give Houdini a second to think as we get more and more lights added into our scene.
Again, it's in post-production where we'll be bringing the intensity of this light way down.
Houdini is just thinking for a second.
Oh, it's thinking about all the different lights that it needs to generate depth map shadows for, and
so there we go. We're actually before the frame where our spotlights come on, which is fantastic because this is showing exactly just what this light is doing. We're getting that nice upper bounce coming from the floor.
Man, does our character look evil. Kind of,
especially as he's getting a very slight blue hue coming from that blue spotlight. So we've got kind of like the red from down below and then the blue from above. That's cool. It's not the look we were going for, but that's really cool. Sweet. So that's going to prove very useful when we come to compositing this together to give us a very subtle bounce light underneath our character.
And let's go ahead and give him some sort of a name as well, like character bounce or something.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense. So I'm going to rename that distance light to character bounce. Fantastic. So that's our first character light in place. Now, before we start creating the two rim lights and the fill light, I'm going to create our null, and I'm going to get our null linked to our character such that it will follow. And I'm also going to get the null set up to aim at one of our shot cameras. I'm going to pick shot 2 and get everything set up for shot 2.
Sounds good. Can I play the role of student for a minute and ask some questions? Now, this light, of course, its position is irrelevant because it's a distant light. I'm referring back to our character bounce light. Any considerations for, just in case anyone's thinking this out there, what about all of the balls that are sitting on the benches, or what about our ladder, the underside of the ladder? When
we render this out as a render pass, we're going to render this out just this light on its own and just for the character. So this light is only ever going to affect our character. He's not going to have any part to play, even though currently if we were to render, he will affect everything else. We're going to, using our render script, specify that this light only affects our character.
Very nice.
Cool. So yeah, let's create our null, which is going to be the parent for our character's lighting rig. So I'm going to create a new null object, enter to accept that, enter to drop that in. And I'm going to rename this to light rig light rig parent underscore shot 02. And with this, let's find our character. And I'm going to right click and copy our translation parameter, come back down to this null, and right click, paste copied relative references for our translation. And that should give us a null that is following our character. Apparently that exploded. That's okay. Yeah, for some reason that got pasted only on Y due to Houdini showing only that channel. So if we right click, paste copied relative references. Let's do that for X, Y, and Z and just change these up manually. So this should be TY, and this should be TZ, because Houdini's deciding not to do exactly what I'm telling it right now. Cool, so we got TX on X, Y, and Z. So now that null is going to follow exactly where our character moves. So now with that null following our character, any lights parented under that null are going to follow around and surround our character. We'd also need to deal with the orientation. So I'm going to jump down to the look at parameter for our null, and I'm going to specify our shot 02 camera, and that's going to rotate our null around so that it's oriented looking at our shot camera. So as our ball moves past the camera, that null is going to maintain looking at our camera, which means that if we parent our lights underneath, they're going to swivel around to always be oriented to our camera.
No, a quick way you could demo that, you could just throw two spheres into the scene, parent those two spheres or the two geometry containers to it.
Sure.
And then you could actually watch them swivel around.
Yeah, I can create a new camera
when you
and
start
set
creating,
it up to...
Yeah, when you start creating spotlights in a minute, it's going to become messy looking in the viewport.
Okay, yeah, let's do it real simple. So I'm going to right-click on the output of our parent, create a sphere.
Geometry container.
Yeah, let's create a...
That's awesome.
That just blew my mind. Fantastic. So we're going to create a geometry container with a sphere in, parent that underneath our node, and let's move this over and up.
That's good.
And then go Control-C, Control-V, duplicate, move him over to the other side, so we kind of got like an orbiting thing going on.
So now
I'm
let's
going to
look
come
to
into the
camera.
front. I'm going to create a new camera because I don't want to rotate shot camera. And if I create a new camera, I can actually move around,
Sure.
all the way around, and see these always lining up, which would be kind of cool. So let's create a new camera, which I'll lock to this view, and then with our null, that's the parent of these two spheres, we can specify the camera we just created, accept. So that's already knocked our orientation because we built it oriented for our shot cam, but as we rotate around, we can see that these are always rotating because our null is rotating. It's hard to see when we're looking at the audience, and even if we were to rotate up, you can see they're maintaining that relationship with the camera. So if these were our lights, they'd be maintaining that relationship with the two rims behind our sphere and the fill in front, which is going to work out fantastically for what we need. So let's delete this camera and then set our light rig parent to look back at our shot 02, and then delete out our two spheres.
Very nice.
Fantastic. So I'm going to move back to where we're dealing with the sphere before we started moving. And I am going to set up so that we can look through our shot camera on this side of the pane and also have a perspective view to work in. So I'm going to come up and create two views side by side and set this one over to be our shot 02 camera, and this one can be our perspective view. And that allows me, because we want to create these lights set up to look like this, but when we're looking through our camera view, because they need to be oriented for the camera, but it's nice to be able to come in behind and translate our lights looking at different angles and then see how they're affecting in terms of how we're looking through the camera. So I'm going to create a new spotlight. I'm just going to create this over behind our character, and due to perspective that's actually not quite behind our character, so I'm going to switch to a top view, and let's grab and move this behind our character, and I'm going to create this rim light here that's on the left hand side as we look at the front of the character. So let's position him over here and switch to a front view and position this up behind our character some. So now we can start to see that we're over here behind our character to the left and above. And we'll notice if we switch over to a perspective view and zoom in, here's our camera, so we're definitely behind the character. Let's just maybe move slightly further to the left. Something like that's going to work out great for us, because now we can come in, we can grab this aim, and if we aim at our character, so let's switch to a top view, grab the aim, and aim at the character, switch to a front view, grab that aim and aim it up at the character. Our rim light is now aiming at the character, but is behind and above and to the left of the character, which is how we defined the spotlight on the whiteboard. Now I am going to take this light and I'm going to boost up its cone angle. And I'm going to boost up the cone angle to 85 degrees. So it's really large, so we're casting light over the entire character and we're not risking having a situation where if the character was to stretch up, he'd end up leaving that cone of light. Now with our rim light, we are going to be emitting both diffuse and specular, and that's just a personal preference on my part. I like having specular highlights from the rim light. I feel that it adds a nice touch to the edge of our character, so I'm going to leave specular highlights enabled. We're not going to be emitting shadows, and we are going to be having a light color of white. So with that, we could render out from this shot and should be able to see clearly a specular highlight around the edge, and also the diffuse around the edge for our rim light. So let's make sure that this is our active view. So space B to bring this up as our main view, and then I'm going to render this view.
And give it just a minute. As we continue adding more lights into the scenario, rendering will slow down.
It really will. Just give it just a second. Cool. So we can see we're getting that really nice rim with a specular highlight as well coming from the rim. So that's our first spotlight, which I really should have parented to the null before I positioned. But that's okay, because we can tell it to keep position when parenting, and then parent, and that's not going to then cause it to spin around. And let's name this to character rim A, underscore shot 02, such that when we duplicate this around, we're going to get 0304 for our various shots. So I'm very happy with that particular rim light. So I'm going to Control C, Control V to create a rim B, with a capital B, for shot 2. And I'm going to jump back to having 2 views, so space B to bring back up our 2 views. Let's switch over to a top view. And I'm going to align our handle with the world. And I'm going to move our spot over more towards this side, noting here's our camera coming through. Let's kind of draw a line from our camera to our sphere. I'm kind of moving over to the other side of that imaginary line. Also keeping an eye down here and seeing our spotlight move.
And if things start to look too confusing, just simply hide out one of the spots over.
Let's hide out the first one.
Yeah, it makes it easier to see what's going on.
So I'll jump back to space B to get 2 views. We've got our spotlight still aimed at the character, but now it's positioned over on the right hand side as we look at the character in the view. And if we jump over to a perspective view, we can confirm that indeed this light is still behind the character relative to the camera. So even with that, we should be able to do a render of this view and see the other rim light as we give it a second to think. And once that rim light's in place, we'll then be able to go ahead and create our fill light in front of the character. There we go, so now we've got a rim light on both sides of our character, so that's working out fantastically.
Now again, you may be concerned about all of this extra illumination that's being applied to objects that should be irrelevant. Steve, you want to talk about passes real quick?
Yeah, so just like with our bounce light, with our red bounce light on the character, this character's lighting rig is only going to be used to illuminate the character, so don't worry about this crazy specular highlight and all the lighting we're getting from those 2 spots on our stage. That's not going to be rendered out because of the way we're breaking everything down. We get to specify exactly which lights we're rendering for which objects, and we're going to be only rendering these rim lights for our character. And the same will apply when we create the fill light for the front of the character, which we can create that fill light now. So I'm going to Control C, Control V our character rim B. And let's hide out the rim to make things nice and clear. And I'm going to name this to character fill underscore shot 02. And the fill light I want to come in front of our character relative to the camera. So I'm going to jump over to a top view and bring our fill light in front of the character relative to the camera. So here's the camera pointing at our character. So I'm going to bring the light to around this position. So I'm going to right click and align the handle with the world and bring our light around to the front. And then I'm going to drop this light down so it's slightly beneath our character. And then let's take the cone angle for this light and boost it up even further than it is now, probably to around 115, just to make sure that there's no chance of us not illuminating the entire character. And just to ensure that even further, I'm going to drop this down a little bit further so we're illuminating upwards. It's going to give us our fill light slightly more towards the bottom of the character than the top, which will hopefully balance the main spotlights really nicely, because the main spots are already giving us very nice illumination on the top of the character, so this will help to bring out the underside of the character. So with the fill light in place, we do want to make sure with a fill light that we're not emitting specular, because this is more adding to the lighting but not supposed to be a main light in itself, so it doesn't need a specular highlight. And I guess we can go ahead and render that out as well and see the fill light. I will space B to bring up this camera view full screen just so we get a larger render when we render out. And give Houdini a second to think once again. And there we go, now we're getting a nice fill light coming from that spot on the front of the character. So that's everything for our light rig for shot 2. If we bring back the visibility on all our lights and tumble around the character, I'm going to home up on our view so that my camera control doesn't just go quite as crazy. So we've got our 3 spotlights surrounding the character, and they're all parented to this null. So if we were to grab all 4 of these nodes, Control-C to copy them, and then Control-V to paste them, you'll notice due to the way that Houdini automatically renames nodes, we're getting shot 3, shot 3, and shot 3. And we can take this, and I can say look at, and specify shot camera 3, and you'll notice that it's rotated, it's looking a bit messy. If we hide out our shot 2 for now, we'll notice that this is now rotated and is oriented now correctly for the shot 3 camera. So we've got our fill on the front side for shot 3 and the 2 rim lights behind. Let's bring back shot 2. So everything is going to look a little bit crazy. We can grab our shot 3, Control-C, Control-V. So we get shot 4, grab our null for shot 4 and make that look at our shot 4 camera, and that will rotate around and align correctly for the shot 4 camera. So with that, that's going to conclude setting up our character's light rig. Thanks a lot.